People spend years wondering why respect feels so difficult to find. They leave one disappointing relationship only to find themselves in another. They walk away from places that slowly diminish them, convinced the next chapter will finally be different, only to discover the same patterns waiting behind different faces. Others apologize for things that were never their fault, carry responsibilities that were never theirs to bear, and give chance after chance to people who have already shown them exactly who they are. Eventually, these experiences begin to feel less like coincidence and more like fate. It becomes tempting to believe that life simply favors certain people while asking others to settle for less. But perhaps the real question is not why these patterns keep appearing. Perhaps it is why they continue finding a place to remain. Long before modern psychology tried to explain this cycle, the Stoics pointed toward a truth that is easy to overlook. They understood that life is shaped not only by what happens to us, but by the judgments through which we experience it. The quiet opinion you hold about your own worth influences far more than your confidence. It determines the standards you accept, the boundaries you defend, the opportunities you believe belong to someone else, and the relationships you continue nurturing long after they have stopped nourishing you. Over time, those invisible judgments become repeated decisions, and those decisions gradually create a life that feels less like chance and more like the reflection of an inner standard that has been operating unnoticed all along. This is why genuine self-worth is so often misunderstood. It is not loud confidence, constant self-praise, or believing you are more important than anyone else. It is the quiet certainty that your values are not for sale. Your peace is not something to negotiate away, and your life does not become richer by chasing the approval of people who were never capable of seeing your value in the first place. Once that understanding begins to take root, everything starts changing in subtle but unmistakable ways. The people you tolerate change. The opportunities you recognize change. Even the choices that once felt impossible begin to feel natural. Without forcing the world to become different, you begin moving through it differently, and that quiet shift changes far more than you ever expected. People often spend years believing that life simply has a strange habit of repeating itself. They leave one friendship feeling unseen, only to find themselves surrounded by people who overlook them again. They escape a relationship that slowly chipped away at their confidence, promising themselves that next time they will choose differently, yet somehow they recognize the same emotional distance wearing a different face. They move from one workplace to another, hoping for appreciation, only to discover that exhaustion follows them wherever they go. After enough disappointments, it becomes easy to accept a quiet conclusion that feels impossible to argue with. This is just how life works. Some people are fortunate enough to receive respect naturally, while others must fight endlessly for scraps of it. It sounds convincing because repeated experiences often look like evidence. The more often something happens, the more permanent it appears. But repetition does not always prove destiny. Sometimes it reveals a pattern that has remained invisible for far too long. The uncomfortable truth is that people rarely notice the standards guiding their decisions because those standards become familiar long before they become visible. No one wakes up intending to accept less than they deserve. No one consciously chooses to be overlooked, manipulated, or undervalued. Those experiences usually begin with much smaller moments that seem insignificant on their own. A request accepted despite growing resentment. An apology offered to restore peace, even when no apology was necessary. A joke tolerated despite causing discomfort. A promise broken without consequence. Each moment feels too small to challenge, yet together they quietly establish the rules by which other people learn to interact with us. As Marcus Aurelius observed, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. The standards you repeatedly accept eventually become the standards your mind begins to expect. Human beings constantly teach others what they will accept, often without realizing they are teaching anything at all. That lesson is rarely delivered through words. It is delivered through repeated behavior. The Stoics paid careful attention to this invisible process because they understood that the quality of a person's life is shaped long before external events fully reveal themselves. They observed that while we cannot control another person's character, we always participate in determining our response to it. This is where many people lose sight of their own influence. They become so focused on changing difficult individuals that they overlook the beliefs quietly directing their own choices. Someone who secretly doubts their value often mistakes endurance for strength. They confuse constant sacrifice with kindness. They believe that tolerating disrespect proves maturity because walking away feels selfish. Slowly, the desire to preserve harmony becomes stronger than the desire to preserve self-respect. The tragedy is not simply that others benefit from this imbalance. The greater tragedy is that the individual begins believing this imbalance is normal. Life has a subtle way of reinforcing whatever remains unexamined. A person who expects disappointment notices disappointment everywhere. A person convinced they must earn basic respect often enters every conversation prepared to prove their worth before anyone has questioned it. Without realizing it, they begin acting from scarcity instead of confidence. Their attention becomes consumed with avoiding rejection instead of recognizing genuine connection. This shift changes more than emotions. It changes behavior. It influences posture, tone of voice, boundaries, decisions, and countless expressions too subtle to measure consciously. Other people respond to those signals even when they cannot explain why. Respect becomes hesitant because certainty is absent. Opportunities seem farther away because they are dismissed before they can even be explored. None of this happens because the world is cruel by nature. It happens because internal expectations quietly shape external choices. This is why luck often receives credit for circumstances that were built through habits of thought over many years. Two individuals can encounter nearly identical situations while reaching completely different outcomes. One immediately recognizes behavior that conflicts with personal values and calmly steps away without anger or resentment. The other remains, hoping patience will eventually transform another person's character. One sees rejection as information. The other experiences it as proof of personal inadequacy. The event itself remains almost identical, but the interpretation changes everything that follows. The Stoic perspective reminds us that events possess far less power than the judgments attached to them. Those judgments become the hidden architects of our future because they quietly determine what we continue pursuing, what we tolerate, and what we leave behind. Perhaps this explains why meaningful change rarely begins with finding better people or better circumstances. It begins much closer than that. Before relationships improve, the definition of acceptable treatment must improve. Before opportunities expand, the belief that they belong within reach must quietly take root. Before peace appears in daily life, inner conflict must gradually lose its authority. None of these changes announce themselves dramatically. They unfold through ordinary decisions, repeated consistently until they become part of one's character. Declining what once felt impossible to refuse, remaining silent instead of over-explaining, accepting that disappointment does not require self-blame, choosing distance without hatred when respect disappears. These actions seem small from the outside, but within the mind they reshape something profound. They redefine what feels normal. People often search for a single breakthrough that will transform everything overnight. But genuine self-worth grows differently. It develops through repeated evidence collected from everyday choices. Each decision that protects personal integrity sends a quiet message inward. Each boundary honored instead of abandoned weakens the old belief that acceptance must always be purchased through sacrifice. Gradually, the mind stops expecting less because it has accumulated enough proof that something better is possible. Confidence formed this way is remarkably stable because it no longer depends on praise, popularity, or constant reassurance. It rests upon consistent action rather than temporary emotion. From that foundation, life begins changing in ways that seem almost surprising. Familiar patterns lose their grip, not because the world has suddenly become kinder, but because the person walking through it has quietly become different. And once that inner standard rises, the experiences that once seemed inevitable no longer feel familiar enough to remain. If these reflections are helping you see yourself a little more clearly, consider subscribing. This is where you explore the ideas that strengthen character, sharpen judgment, and cultivate lasting inner peace. Hidden beliefs rarely announce themselves with dramatic thoughts or obvious declarations. They settle quietly beneath awareness, becoming so familiar that they begin to feel like simple facts about life. A person may never say, "I am not worthy of respect," and still carry that belief into every conversation they have. Another may never admit they fear rejection, yet constantly shape their words around keeping everyone comfortable. These convictions do not need to be spoken to influence behavior. They reveal themselves through hesitation, through unnecessary explanations, through opportunities abandoned before they are even explored. This is why two people with similar abilities often create remarkably different lives. The difference is not always talent, intelligence, or luck. More often, it is the invisible story each person quietly tells themselves about what they deserve. That story becomes the lens through which every event is interpreted, and after enough time, it begins to feel as though the world itself is confirming what they already believed. The Stoics devoted great attention to perception because they understood that human beings do not experience reality directly. They experience their judgments about reality. Long before an event influences emotions, the mind has already decided what that event means. A delayed reply becomes rejection. Constructive criticism becomes proof of inadequacy. A closed door becomes evidence that success belongs to someone else. The event remains unchanged, but the judgment surrounding it transforms the entire experience. This happens so quickly that most people never notice the interpretation taking place. They simply react to the feeling it produces. Over months and years, these repeated judgments begin shaping expectations, and expectations quietly become standards. Someone expecting disappointment enters situations differently from someone expecting possibility. They notice different details, make different decisions, and carry themselves with an entirely different presence without consciously trying to do so. Because these beliefs operate beneath awareness, they often survive even when external circumstances improve. A person may finally receive the promotion they worked toward for years, yet immediately begin worrying they are not capable enough to deserve it. Another enters a healthy relationship but remains suspicious of genuine affection because previous disappointments taught them to expect abandonment. Success arrives, but the mind refuses to accept it. Instead of feeling gratitude, it prepares for loss. Instead of embracing stability, it searches for hidden problems. The old belief quietly protects its position by interpreting every positive experience through the same familiar filter. This is why changing circumstances alone rarely creates lasting peace. If perception remains untouched, the mind continues producing the same emotional patterns even inside entirely different environments. Notice how easily hidden beliefs disguise themselves as personality. Someone describes themselves as overly cautious, but beneath that caution lives the fear of failure. Someone claims to be endlessly patient, while quietly believing they must tolerate disrespect to be loved. Another insists they simply prefer staying unnoticed, although deep inside they are convinced their voice carries little value. These identities feel permanent because they have been repeated for years, yet they are often nothing more than conclusions formed long ago under completely different circumstances. A difficult childhood, repeated criticism, broken trust, or prolonged uncertainty can teach lessons that remain active long after those situations have disappeared. The mind continues protecting itself from dangers that no longer exist, responding to the present through memories that have quietly become beliefs. This explains why genuine self-respect feels unfamiliar at first. It asks the mind to question conclusions it has accepted without examination. A calm disagreement no longer feels dangerous. Saying no without guilt becomes possible. Accepting appreciation without immediately dismissing it begins to feel natural instead of uncomfortable. None of these actions require becoming a different person. They require seeing yourself through a different judgment. Epictetus expressed this idea clearly. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them. The Stoic approach was never about controlling every circumstance. It was about carefully examining the opinions directing your responses before those responses quietly directed your life. Once that habit develops, something remarkable begins to happen. Situations that once triggered anxiety lose much of their emotional force because the interpretation surrounding them has changed. The external event remains exactly as it was, but your relationship with it becomes entirely different. Opportunities often disappear long before they are rejected by anyone else. They disappear inside the imagination. A position goes unclaimed because someone assumes they are unqualified. A conversation never begins because rejection has already been accepted internally. A creative idea remains hidden because criticism feels inevitable. From the outside, these opportunities appear lost through circumstance. From the inside, they were surrendered before reality even had the chance to respond. Hidden beliefs quietly remove possibilities from consideration, making life appear smaller than it truly is. This shrinking rarely feels intentional. It feels practical, responsible, or realistic. Yet realism shaped by fear is still fear. It simply wears more convincing language. Relationships reveal these internal judgments even more clearly. People who quietly question their own value often become experts at studying everyone else's emotions while neglecting their own. They notice shifts in tone, subtle expressions, and changing moods with remarkable precision because their attention has been trained toward preserving acceptance. While this sensitivity can appear compassionate, it often comes with an invisible cost. Their own needs become secondary. Their own discomfort becomes negotiable. Their own peace becomes dependent upon keeping everyone else satisfied. Eventually, they begin feeling emotionally exhausted without understanding why. The answer is rarely that they cared too much. More often, they stopped believing their own well-being deserved equal attention. Changing this pattern does not require becoming colder, harsher, or detached from others. It requires becoming more honest with yourself, honest about the standards guiding your decisions, honest about the judgments shaping your reactions, honest about the beliefs quietly influencing what feels possible and what feels impossible. Once those hidden assumptions begin losing their authority, decisions become clearer. Relationships become healthier because they are chosen instead of chased. Opportunities become visible because they are no longer dismissed before they appear. Gradually, life begins reflecting a different internal standard, not because fortune has suddenly become generous, but because perception itself has changed, and with it, every choice that quietly shapes the direction of a human life. Chasing approval rarely feels like weakness while it is happening. It often disguises itself as kindness, patience, flexibility, or emotional maturity. You convince yourself that keeping everyone happy is simply the right thing to do. You become careful with your words, thoughtful with your actions, and increasingly aware of how every decision might affect the opinions of others. At first, this seems like a strength. People appreciate how accommodating you are. They describe you as easygoing, dependable, and understanding. Yet beneath that pleasant image, something subtle begins to disappear. Decisions become slower because they require permission from someone else's approval. Honest opinions become quieter because disagreement feels dangerous. The desire to be accepted slowly becomes stronger than the desire to remain true to yourself. This transformation happens so gradually that it often goes unnoticed, until one day you realize you no longer know whether your choices truly belong to you. The Stoics understood that peace cannot exist where judgment is constantly outsourced. As long as another person's opinion determines your emotional stability, your life remains tied to circumstances you cannot control. This does not mean ignoring feedback or refusing to learn from others. Wisdom often grows through listening. The danger begins when approval becomes a necessity instead of a welcome addition. A person who depends on praise will eventually fear criticism more than they value honesty. They begin adjusting themselves to fit every room they enter, changing their personality slightly depending on who is watching. Different conversations bring different versions of the same person, not because they are dishonest, but because they have forgotten where their own center truly is. Without realizing it, they stop asking whether something aligns with their values and begin asking whether it will be accepted. This quiet dependence changes the way others respond as well. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to certainty. They may not consciously recognize it, but they notice when someone trusts their own judgment and when someone constantly seeks reassurance. Consider two people expressing the exact same idea. One speaks calmly, prepared to accept disagreement without becoming defensive. The other delivers the same thought while immediately explaining, apologizing, and searching every face for signs of approval. The words are almost identical, yet the presence behind them feels entirely different. Confidence is rarely about speaking louder or appearing fearless. More often, it comes from no longer needing every person in the room to agree before believing your own thoughts have value. The search for validation creates another hidden problem. It trains your attention in the wrong direction. Instead of observing your own principles, your mind becomes occupied with reading the emotional reactions of everyone around you. You begin measuring success by smiles, compliments, invitations, and recognition. Good days become dependent upon external praise. Difficult days feel unbearable because silence is mistaken for rejection. Over time, this creates emotional instability. Your inner world rises and falls according to forces completely outside your control. One encouraging conversation fills you with confidence. One dismissive remark erases it. The Stoic approach offers a quieter alternative. Rather than asking whether others approve, it asks whether your actions remain consistent with your own character. That single shift restores a remarkable amount of freedom because it places your attention back where it has always belonged. Many people believe they are searching for love, respect, or acceptance, when in reality they are searching for evidence that they matter. Those are very different pursuits. Genuine respect cannot grow where self-respect is absent, because every interaction becomes an attempt to fill an internal emptiness that no amount of external praise can permanently satisfy. Even compliments lose their power. They provide temporary relief, but the old uncertainty quietly returns, asking for more reassurance. This cycle becomes exhausting because it has no natural ending. There will always be another opinion to consider, another expectation to satisfy, another standard to meet. The finish line continues moving farther away because it was never located outside you in the first place. Breaking this pattern rarely requires dramatic change. It begins with small acts of quiet independence. Speaking honestly without immediately correcting yourself. Allowing disagreement to exist without treating it as failure. Accepting that not everyone will understand your decisions, and recognizing that this is neither a tragedy nor a personal flaw. These moments feel uncomfortable at first because they challenge habits developed over many years. The mind expects approval the way it expects certainty. When that approval does not arrive, old fears naturally surface. But each time you remain grounded instead of chasing reassurance, something begins to strengthen. You discover that discomfort passes. Criticism survives without destroying you. Silence loses much of its power. Gradually, your presence changes in ways that cannot be manufactured through appearance alone. Conversations become calmer because you are no longer trying to convince everyone of your worth. Boundaries become clearer because they no longer depend upon permission. Relationships become more genuine because they are built upon honesty rather than performance. Ironically, this is often the point where respect begins appearing more naturally. People trust those who trust themselves. They feel safe around individuals who are not constantly negotiating their own identity. Inner authority carries a quiet steadiness that does not demand attention, yet it rarely goes unnoticed. Once your sense of value begins resting on your own principles instead of shifting public opinion, the need to chase approval slowly disappears, leaving behind something far more enduring than praise could ever provide. Every compromise begins by looking harmless. It feels easier to stay quiet than to create tension. It feels kinder to overlook another broken promise than to risk conflict. It feels wiser to keep the peace than to explain why something hurt you. None of these decisions seem important when viewed alone. In fact, they often appear mature. You tell yourself that everyone has flaws, that no relationship is perfect, and that patience is a sign of strength. Those thoughts contain some truth, which is why they are so convincing. But there is another truth quietly growing beneath them. Every time you ignore your own principles simply to preserve someone else's comfort, you send a message in two directions at once. Other people learn what they can expect from you, while your own mind learns what it should expect for itself. That second lesson is often the one people never notice until it has shaped years of their lives. The Stoic perspective offers a remarkably practical response to this problem. It reminds us that we cannot force others to value our principles, but we can decide whether we are willing to abandon them ourselves. That distinction changes everything. Instead of constantly asking how another person should behave, attention returns to the only place where meaningful authority truly exists: your own conduct, your own standards, your own willingness to remain consistent even when consistency feels uncomfortable. This is not stubbornness, nor is it emotional distance. It is quiet stability. It is the understanding that preserving your character is more important than preserving temporary approval. Once this becomes your focus, difficult conversations lose much of their fear because honesty no longer depends upon guaranteeing a pleasant outcome. The Stoics never suggested becoming emotionless. That misunderstanding has followed their philosophy for generations. They understood that emotions are natural responses, not personal failures. Fear appears, anger rises, sadness arrives. None of these experiences make someone weak. The real challenge begins afterward. Will that emotion become your master, or will it become information you can examine before acting? Someone insults you, and anger immediately demands retaliation. Another person ignores your effort, and disappointment urges you to withdraw completely. Anxiety tells you to avoid the opportunity because failure feels unbearable. These impulses often arrive with remarkable force, convincing you that immediate action is necessary. Yet emotions speak in the language of urgency. Wisdom speaks more quietly. Emotional discipline creates enough space between those two voices that you no longer mistake one for the other. This pause may appear insignificant from the outside, but internally, it changes everything. A few moments of reflection can prevent words that would damage a relationship, decisions that would create regret, or reactions that reinforce old habits you have been trying to leave behind. Consider how often people explain their worst decisions by saying they were overwhelmed, frustrated, embarrassed, or afraid. In nearly every case, the emotion itself was not the true problem. The problem was allowing that temporary feeling to become permanent behavior. Seneca captured this with a simple observation: the greatest remedy for anger is delay. The Stoic approach reminds us that while emotions may knock on the door without invitation, they do not deserve ownership of the house. They are visitors. They may stay for a while, but they should never become the ones directing your life. One of the greatest gifts emotional discipline provides is freedom from impulsive approval seeking. When someone criticizes you, the immediate desire is often to defend yourself. When someone misunderstands your intentions, the impulse is to explain every detail until they finally agree. When someone withdraws affection, the instinct may be to chase after reassurance. These reactions feel natural because they promise immediate relief from discomfort. Unfortunately, they also reinforce the belief that your peace depends upon another person's response. Emotional discipline interrupts this cycle. It reminds you that not every misunderstanding requires correction, not every criticism deserves a defense, and not every silence must be filled. Sometimes the strongest response is patience. Sometimes it is restraint. Sometimes it is choosing not to participate in an argument your emotions desperately wanted to win. This quiet restraint should never be confused with passivity. It is not about suppressing your voice or pretending difficult emotions do not exist. It is about choosing your response instead of allowing your first impulse to choose it for you. There is remarkable strength in remaining calm while others expect anger. There is confidence in refusing to seek revenge simply because your pride feels wounded. There is dignity in accepting that another person's behavior reflects their character more than it defines yours. These choices often appear invisible because they do not attract applause. No one celebrates the argument you avoided or the resentment you quietly released. Yet those unseen victories shape character far more deeply than public recognition ever could. Over time, emotional discipline begins changing your relationship with uncertainty as well. Situations that once produced panic gradually lose their ability to control you. A setback becomes something to understand rather than something to fear. Rejection becomes information instead of personal condemnation. Criticism becomes an opportunity to evaluate whether adjustment is necessary instead of an automatic attack on your identity. This shift creates extraordinary stability because your confidence is no longer built upon constantly receiving favorable outcomes. It is built upon trusting your ability to respond wisely, regardless of the outcome. That kind of confidence cannot be taken away by another person's opinion, because it was never created by their approval in the first place. There is another subtle transformation that often goes unnoticed. Emotional discipline teaches you to respect your future self. Impulsive decisions usually satisfy the present while creating unnecessary burdens for tomorrow. Harsh words may provide temporary satisfaction, but leave lasting regret. Escaping responsibility feels comforting for a moment while quietly increasing future anxiety. Chasing immediate validation may soothe insecurity briefly while strengthening dependence upon external approval. Each time you resist these impulses, you are making a decision that benefits the person you are becoming rather than the emotion you are experiencing right now. Self-respect grows through these repeated acts of loyalty toward your future character. You begin trusting yourself because you repeatedly prove that temporary feelings will not easily pull you away from your deeper values. Eventually, people notice something different about you, even if they cannot fully explain it. Your presence feels calmer because your emotions are no longer competing for control of every conversation. Decisions appear steadier because they are guided by principles rather than moods. Difficult situations still affect you, but they no longer define you. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing your peace does not depend upon perfect circumstances or constant admiration. It comes from recognizing that no matter what life places before you, your greatest strength remains the ability to choose your response with intention instead of impulse. Once that realization becomes part of your daily life, self-respect stops feeling like something you hope to achieve someday. It becomes something you quietly practice every time you refuse to let temporary emotions speak louder than your enduring character. As your confidence becomes less dependent on the opinions of other people, something unexpected begins to happen. You stop thinking about boundaries as rules you must force onto difficult individuals. Instead, they become a natural expression of how you see yourself. This shift is subtle, yet it changes everything. A person who genuinely values themselves does not spend every conversation wondering where to draw the line, because the line already exists within their character. They no longer need to rehearse endless explanations or convince others that their needs deserve consideration. Their decisions begin reflecting an internal certainty that was once missing. What they accept, what they decline, and what they quietly walk away from all begin flowing from the same place. Boundaries stop feeling like walls built out of fear and start feeling like quiet reminders that self-respect deserves the same consistency as respect offered to anyone else. Many people hesitate to establish healthy boundaries because they mistake them for rejection. They worry that saying no makes them selfish, that declining unreasonable demands makes them difficult, or that protecting their own peace somehow proves they care less about others. This misunderstanding causes countless people to carry responsibilities that were never truly theirs. They become emotional caretakers, problem solvers, and constant sources of reassurance while quietly neglecting their own well-being. The Stoic perspective offers a calmer way of seeing this. It reminds us that compassion does not require self-neglect. You may care deeply for another person without surrendering responsibility for your own life. In fact, genuine kindness often becomes clearer once it is no longer driven by fear of losing approval. It becomes a choice instead of an obligation, and that difference changes both the giver and the receiver. The absence of boundaries rarely creates stronger relationships. More often, it creates confusion. When people never express discomfort, others are left to assume everything is acceptable. Expectations slowly grow because nothing suggests they should stop. Extra favors become ordinary. Constant availability becomes expected. Emotional support becomes one-sided. Over time, one person feels increasingly exhausted while the other remains unaware that anything has changed. This imbalance is not always created through selfishness. Sometimes it grows simply because silence has replaced honesty. The longer that silence continues, the more difficult it becomes to speak. Resentment quietly accumulates beneath the surface until even small interactions begin carrying the weight of years of unspoken frustration. This is why clear boundaries often feel uncomfortable at first. They interrupt patterns that have existed for a long time. People who benefited from unlimited access to your time or energy may not immediately understand the change. Some may even resist it. That reaction often causes unnecessary guilt because it feels like evidence that you have done something wrong. In reality, discomfort is sometimes nothing more than the natural response to healthier expectations replacing familiar habits. The person you are becoming no longer participates in the same patterns that once left you emotionally depleted. That adjustment requires patience, not because your boundaries are unfair, but because lasting change often challenges routines that everyone had quietly accepted. One of the greatest signs that self-worth has become internal is the disappearance of constant explanation. People who depend upon external validation usually feel compelled to justify every decision. They apologize for protecting their schedule. They over-explain why they cannot help. They search for reasons that sound acceptable enough to avoid disappointing someone else. Gradually, this habit begins fading. A respectful answer no longer needs endless defense. A thoughtful no becomes complete on its own. This does not come from arrogance or indifference. It comes from trusting that your decisions do not require universal approval in order to be valid. Quiet confidence speaks briefly, because it is no longer trying to earn permission to exist. As these changes continue, relationships naturally begin shifting. Certain connections become stronger because they were built upon mutual respect from the beginning. Honest conversations replace silent assumptions. Appreciation becomes more genuine because generosity is freely chosen instead of quietly expected. At the same time, other relationships begin fading without dramatic endings. They slowly lose momentum because they depended upon your willingness to ignore your own needs. While this can feel painful, it also reveals something important. Not every relationship survives personal growth, and not every ending represents failure. Sometimes distance appears because two people were connected through imbalance rather than genuine understanding. Once the imbalance disappears, the relationship no longer has anything healthy to stand upon. Many people fear losing relationships far more than they fear losing themselves. They continue investing energy into connections that leave them emotionally drained because loneliness appears more frightening than disappointment. Yet there is another form of loneliness that receives far less attention. It is the loneliness of constantly abandoning your own values to remain accepted, sitting beside people while feeling unseen, agreeing with conversations that quietly violate your principles, smiling while carrying exhaustion that no one else recognizes. This kind of loneliness often lasts much longer because it hides beneath the appearance of belonging. The Stoic path encourages something different. It asks you to value the quality of your relationships more than their quantity, and to measure closeness through honesty rather than constant proximity. Over time, the people entering your life begin reflecting these new standards. This is not because the world suddenly offers different individuals. It is because your decisions have changed. You recognize warning signs sooner. You no longer confuse inconsistency with mystery or emotional distance with depth. Respect becomes attractive in ways it never fully was before, because your own mind has learned to recognize it as familiar rather than unusual. You naturally invest more energy in people whose actions align with their words, and less energy in those who continually require excuses for behavior that quietly diminishes your peace. These choices seem ordinary, but together they reshape your entire social world. Eventually, you stop thinking of boundaries as something you must remember to enforce. They become part of the way you live. You no longer chase every relationship, rescue every situation, or carry responsibility for emotions that belong to someone else. Instead, your energy begins flowing toward people who meet honesty with honesty, respect with respect, and kindness with kindness. Your circle may become smaller, but it also becomes lighter. Conversations feel calmer because they are no longer sustained through constant self-sacrifice. Trust grows naturally because it rests upon mutual consideration instead of silent endurance. The greatest reward is not simply that healthier relationships replace draining ones. It is that you finally experience the quiet freedom of knowing your peace no longer depends upon being everything for everyone. And from that place, the connections that remain become deeper, steadier, and far more worthy of the life you are choosing to build. Something remarkable begins to happen when your actions finally stop arguing with your values. The constant inner negotiation slowly disappears. You no longer spend hours wondering whether you said the right thing simply because you spoke honestly. You stop replaying conversations, searching for ways you could have been more agreeable at the expense of your own convictions. Decisions become quieter because they are no longer pulled in opposite directions by fear and integrity. There is an unexpected sense of relief that comes from no longer trying to become whoever the situation demands. Instead, you begin carrying the same principles into every room you enter. The version of yourself that appears with strangers slowly becomes the same version that exists when no one is watching. That kind of consistency creates something many people spend years searching for, without realizing it cannot be found through appearance alone. It creates authenticity. Authenticity is often misunderstood. Many assume it means expressing every thought without restraint or refusing to consider the feelings of others. In reality, authenticity has very little to do with saying whatever comes to mind. It is the quiet alignment between what you believe, what you value, and what you consistently choose to do. Carl Jung expressed this beautifully. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. A person can be thoughtful, respectful, and compassionate while remaining deeply authentic, because authenticity is not measured by volume. It is measured by congruence. When your inner principles and outward behavior support each other instead of competing against each other, the mind no longer wastes energy maintaining different versions of yourself. That hidden conflict begins to dissolve, leaving behind a steadiness that others often notice before you do. The Stoics understood that character is revealed through repeated action rather than occasional intention. Good intentions feel comforting because they allow us to believe we are already becoming the person we hope to be. Action is less forgiving. It quietly asks whether our choices actually reflect our values when circumstances become inconvenient. Anyone can speak about honesty until honesty creates discomfort. Anyone can value patience until frustration appears. Anyone can believe in self-respect until preserving it requires disappointing someone else. This is where consistency quietly separates ideals from identity. The values you return to repeatedly become the foundation upon which your character rests. Everything else remains an interesting opinion waiting for proof. One reason consistency feels so powerful is that the human mind naturally seeks stability. We trust people whose behavior remains grounded because we know where we stand with them. There is comfort in knowing that someone's kindness is genuine rather than strategic, that their honesty does not disappear under pressure, and that their respect is not offered only when it is convenient. The opposite is equally true. Constant inconsistency creates uncertainty. Someone who changes according to every environment becomes difficult to understand because their identity shifts with every conversation. One day they are confident, the next they are uncertain. One day they establish boundaries, the next they abandon them to avoid conflict. This unpredictability creates emotional confusion, not only for others, but also for the person living it. Many people spend years trying to become more attractive without realizing that emotional stability is one of the most attractive qualities a person can possess. It has little to do with appearance, status, or charm. Stability creates safety. It allows people to relax because they are no longer trying to predict which version of you they will encounter. Your words begin carrying more weight because they are supported by your actions. Promises become meaningful because they are consistently honored. Boundaries become respected because they remain steady instead of changing according to temporary emotions. This quiet reliability cannot be imitated through confidence alone. It grows through countless ordinary moments where your behavior continues reflecting your principles despite changing circumstances. As this stability develops, another interesting change begins taking place. The kinds of people who feel naturally drawn toward you slowly begin changing as well. Individuals who depended upon your uncertainty often become less interested because uncertainty is what allowed them to influence your decisions. Someone who relied on guilt to obtain your attention now discovers that guilt no longer produces the same result. Someone who expected endless emotional labor realizes your energy is no longer available without consideration. These shifts may initially feel uncomfortable because familiar relationships begin changing shape. Yet beneath that discomfort lies something incredibly valuable. Space begins opening for healthier connections that were difficult to recognize while your attention remained occupied by relationships built upon imbalance. People who genuinely respect themselves also tend to appreciate consistency in others. They are not searching for someone who performs perfection. They are searching for someone whose character remains dependable through both comfort and difficulty. This is why healthier relationships often develop more quietly than unhealthy ones. They do not rely on emotional extremes, constant uncertainty, or dramatic cycles of disappointment followed by temporary reconciliation. Instead, they grow through trust built gradually over time. Conversations become easier because honesty replaces performance. Disagreements become manageable because neither person feels compelled to protect a fragile identity. Mutual respect quietly replaces constant emotional negotiation, creating a sense of peace that once seemed almost unfamiliar. There is another benefit to living consistently that often receives little attention. Your own mind begins becoming a place of greater peace. Internal conflict decreases because your decisions no longer require endless justification afterward. You stop wondering whether you betrayed your values simply to gain temporary approval. Regret appears less frequently because your choices increasingly reflect who you truly want to become, instead of who you felt pressured to be in a particular moment. Even when outcomes are disappointing, they become easier to accept because you know your actions remained aligned with your principles. Failure loses much of its power when it no longer carries the additional burden of self-betrayal. Gradually, authenticity stops feeling like something you are trying to achieve and becomes the natural consequence of living with greater integrity. People begin responding differently, not because you have learned techniques to influence them, but because they sense the absence of inner conflict. There is less hesitation in your decisions, less anxiety in your conversations, and less desperation beneath your kindness. The confidence that emerges from this place is remarkably quiet because it no longer depends on convincing anyone of your value. It simply reflects the evidence collected through your own consistent choices. From there, life begins unfolding in a noticeably different way. Relationships become fewer, but they carry greater depth. Opportunities become more meaningful because they align with your values rather than your fears. And without chasing admiration or recognition, you discover that the people who remain are often those who recognize stability, appreciate sincerity, and respect the quiet strength of someone whose actions have finally become an honest reflection of the person they have chosen to be. After enough reflection, something becomes impossible to ignore. The life you experience each day is influenced far less by random chance than it first appeared. The people who remain close to you, the opportunities you recognize, the conversations you choose to continue, and even the way you respond when difficulty arrives, all begin reflecting something much deeper than circumstance. This realization can feel uncomfortable because it removes the comforting illusion that everything is happening to you without your participation. At the same time, it offers something far more valuable. It reminds you that meaningful change is still possible. Not because the world suddenly becomes kinder or because fortune decides to favor you, but because the person moving through that world is no longer guided by the same hidden beliefs that once shaped every decision. The quality of your life begins changing long before the results become visible, because transformation always starts within the choices that no one else can see. Many people hear the phrase that you attract what you are, then immediately imagine mysterious forces arranging events beyond explanation. That interpretation often misses something far more practical and far more powerful. You do not attract better experiences simply because you wish for them with greater intensity. You attract different experiences because your standards quietly change the decisions you make every day. You stop giving endless chances to behavior that repeatedly destroys your peace. You become more attentive to consistency than empty promises. You recognize respect not because it suddenly appears everywhere, but because your mind has finally learned to distinguish it from temporary attention. What once felt exciting may now feel exhausting. What once felt ordinary may now reveal extraordinary depth. The world itself has not fundamentally changed. Your perception has, and perception quietly influences every direction your life begins to take. Attention is one of the greatest forces shaping human experience. Wherever your attention consistently rests, your life gradually follows. Someone constantly searching for signs of rejection will notice rejection even inside neutral situations. Another person focused on protecting their peace naturally begins recognizing environments where that peace can actually exist. This shift rarely happens through deliberate effort alone. It develops because valuing yourself changes what your mind considers important. Instead of chasing excitement, you begin appreciating stability. Instead of becoming fascinated by unpredictability, you notice reliability. Instead of feeling responsible for changing difficult people, you quietly invest your energy where mutual respect already exists. Attention becomes selective rather than desperate. The result is not a smaller life. It is a clearer one. This change influences opportunities as much as relationships. When your worth no longer depends upon constant approval, fear begins losing much of its authority. You speak when your voice matters instead of remaining silent to avoid criticism. You pursue possibilities that once felt unrealistic because the old belief that success belonged to someone else has quietly faded. Mistakes stop carrying the same emotional weight because they no longer threaten your identity. They become lessons instead of verdicts. As Epictetus reminded us, it is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows. This creates a remarkable sense of freedom. You begin acting from curiosity rather than insecurity. Progress replaces perfection. The Stoics understood that freedom begins where dependence ends. As long as your peace depends upon favorable circumstances, admiration, or constant reassurance, your inner world remains fragile because it rests upon things beyond your control. Valuing yourself changes that relationship completely. Your confidence becomes rooted in conduct rather than outcome. You no longer judge yourself solely by victories or disappointments. Instead, you ask whether your actions reflected the person you are trying to become. This quiet shift creates extraordinary resilience. Perhaps the greatest transformation is not found in what enters your life, but in what quietly leaves it behind. Endless overthinking begins fading because every decision no longer depends upon universal approval. The need to rescue every relationship gradually disappears because you recognize that mutual effort cannot be created by one person alone. Constant comparison loses much of its influence because another person's path no longer determines the value of your own. Even fear changes its shape. It remains part of life, but it stops sitting in the seat where your judgment belongs. These quiet departures often receive little attention because they happen gradually, yet they free an enormous amount of emotional energy that was once consumed by battles you were never meant to fight. People around you often notice these changes before you fully understand them yourself. Conversations become calmer because you no longer seek constant validation. Decisions become clearer because they reflect your principles instead of temporary emotions. Your presence carries a steadiness that cannot be manufactured through appearance, clever words, or carefully crafted confidence. Marcus Aurelius captured this quiet strength when he wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." Others begin responding differently, not because you have learned to influence them through techniques or manipulation, but because certainty has replaced hesitation. The uncertainty that once invited confusion quietly disappears. In its place stands someone who knows what they value, what they will protect, and what they are willing to leave behind without bitterness. That quiet certainty often inspires more respect than any attempt to earn it ever could. Looking back, you may realize that the greatest changes were almost invisible while they were happening. No single morning arrived announcing that your life had transformed. Instead, one thoughtful decision led to another. One healthy boundary replaced years of silent resentment. One honest conversation restored trust in your own voice. One act of emotional discipline prevented another cycle of regret. As Aristotle observed, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Piece by piece, the person who once accepted less gradually disappeared, replaced not by someone perfect, but by someone far more aligned with their own values. That alignment became the foundation upon which everything else quietly began changing. This is why valuing yourself is never an act of arrogance. It is an act of responsibility. It is the decision to stop measuring your worth through opinions that change from one moment to the next, and to begin measuring it through the consistency of your own character. From that place, better relationships become possible because you no longer confuse attention with respect. Better opportunities become visible because you no longer dismiss yourself before life has the chance to respond. Greater peace becomes sustainable because it is built upon principles rather than circumstances. In the end, the greatest reward is not that life suddenly becomes effortless. It is that you finally become someone who no longer needs to chase what truly belongs with you. Once your standards rise, your choices become wiser, your attention becomes clearer, your actions become steadier, and the quality of everything surrounding you naturally begins to rise as well. That is not a mystery. It is the quiet consequence of becoming the kind of person who believes, through action rather than words, that they are no longer willing to settle for less than the life they are capable of building. The greatest transformation is never found in changing the world around you. It begins the moment you stop negotiating your own worth. When your values become stronger than your fears, your decisions become clearer, your mind becomes quieter, and your life naturally begins reflecting the standards you choose to live by. That is the quiet strength the Stoics spent a lifetime cultivating, and it remains just as powerful today. Thank you for spending this time with us and for being part of Stoic Journal. If this message resonated with you, the next video on your screen will take this journey even deeper. Watch it now and continue building the kind of mind that no circumstance can easily disturb. Until next time, take care.